what if we cannot rely anymore at all on things we find online and we don't have a way to verify? Moreover, what if it brings down science? So recently there was a research paper also showing indications of massive increase in use of generative AI in scientific papers, but it's full of misinformation. What if, you know, sure, science is not perfect, but what if it's like barely reliable? We can't rely on science. We can't rely on anything that happens online. To me, that's the most dystopian scenario.
Hi, friends, and welcome to this exciting episode of Leading with Data. Today, I have with me Dr. Ravit Dotan. Ravit is currently the founder and CEO of TechBetter, her consulting company, and her focus is on responsible AI. Her mission is to make AI responsible by minimizing ways it causes harm and maximize the ways to do social good with it. During the episode, we discuss how you should think about creating responsible AI, when should you start thinking about responsible AI, and what you can do to build responsible AI products. Ravit also shares some real life challenges and research which brings out the importance of creating these responsibly AI products. So go ahead and enjoy the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. So, Ravit, I would want to start about how you got into responsible AI and how was your journey, and then when did it occur to you that this is your calling?
Ah, fantastic question. Okay, which point do I start at? Okay, I'll go backwards. So
Hmm.
before I was in this incarnation of my career, I was in philosophy. I was
Okay.
doing my PhD in philosophy at UC Berkeley. And
Okay.
I was working on a topic called epistemology and also philosophy of science. Um,
Hmm.
Epistemology is about knowing, like, what does it mean to know something? What does it take? And um, I was interested in science as a case study because science, the
Hmm.
stereotype is that that's where reasoning is at its best, right? That's like the
Yeah.
model. And I was curious, what is so good about science? What is happening there? And within philosophy of science, there's a subdiscipline called values in science. And that discipline is interested in how values shape science inherently. And I was very interested in that. And so, about 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this thought that when science is at its best, it's so-called value-free. There are no values because it's totally objective. Um,
Okay.
and then people,
Interesting.
yeah, and then people started realizing, wait a minute, that doesn't, no, it doesn't make sense. So fast forward to the beginning of this century, the 21st century. People in philosophy of science are talking about, well, of course, the values are there, but how do we manage them well, right? So values is something that it's not necessarily bad. It's only bad if you don't notice how it's shaping you. So I was listening to this conversation within philosophy, and I was thinking, okay, we've been talking about physics and biology and social sciences for like a century in recent history of philosophy and philosophy of science. But what about this new discipline, machine learning?
Interesting.
Machine learning to me is a combination of science and engineering. And I kept hearing from, computer science friends and also just online the same thought, machine learning is just numbers. No values. It's totally objective. Totally objective. When machine learning is at its best, it is value free. And I thought, well, that's funny. Didn't we already talk about this though? About physics and
Uh,
biology and all of the natural sciences. So I started by thinking about how do we take what we've learned about science and apply it to machine learning. And I wanted to show that, yes, this discipline too is deeply embedded with social and political values, not because it's bad, it's a feature, not a bug, right? The question
Yeah.
is detect the values and use them in a productive way. So that was my beginning. But previously in my career, how did I fund all of my education? I worked in tech. And so one of my first jobs actually was I don't know, like 15 years ago, was an AI company. Of course, at the
Oh,
time
wow.
we didn't. Yeah, at the time we just called it computer vision. And then my undergrad was physics and chemistry, which is where some of my coding capabilities come from, and my math skills. So the trajectory that led me here is a combination of tech background, a little bit of STEM, a lot of philosophy, but not, okay, I guess I'm going to be cliche and say wanting positive social impact, wanting the ecosystem to be different is what made me switch from the academic sector, which I was in, into the industry.
Interesting. And when you looked at machine learning, and you know, when you think about responsible AI as a field, uh, how do you look at it? Because the spectrum is so wide, and it's also evolving, right? So on one end of spectrum are questions like, where did you get your data from, and do you have the permission to even use it, all the way up to, let's say, extreme catastrophic AI scenario. So the spectrum is very broad, and it's also evolving, right? There was no talk about agents a few months back, and today agents are all of a sudden taking a lot more delegation from its users. So when you look at the overall field, how do you kind of put your thinking around? Is there any framework thought in the way you look at the overall field?
Yeah. So I'll start by making sure we're on the same page. It sounds like, or maybe adding something to listeners who might not be familiar. There's this dichotomy that happens in the responsible AI space, right? On the one hand, there are people who call themselves long termists or something, existential risk, and they think about doomsday scenarios, sci-fi, Armageddon style. So that's one side, and then the other side um, is focused on things like privacy, like you've mentioned, bias, transparency, explainability, and so there's this divide within the AI ethics community. And so, of course, a question invites itself: look at which side of the divide am I on? Is that the kind of question you had in mind?
So not exactly which side you are on, but when you think about it, how do you see this overall spectrum, and then what are the kind of key areas? So let's say I am completely new to this field, and I ask you, what is responsible AI? How would you describe it? What would be your answer? What's the lens through which you look at responsible
Got it. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Yeah. So to me, AI responsibility is not in the AI itself. It's on the people who
AI?
make it, use it, buy it, invest in it, insure it, all kinds of interaction. Responsible AI to me is AI that is developed, deployed, bought, engaged with broadly in ways that take into account social implications. So both minimizing risks and maximizing the benefits. So in a tech company, for example, responsible AI would be the outcome of responsible development processes.
Mhm. Okay. And most of the work which you do, you focus either on startups or VCs or people who are essentially investing in these startups, right? And then because either it's AI getting created, or people who are kind of funding the AI creation. Uh, from that lens, what are some of the key things? Let's say if I am a startup working on an AI product, how should I think about it? And is there a particular time or layer or where responsible AI kicks in, or it is something to be kept in mind from the start? So how do I think about making my products which have AI responsible?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I'm thinking of the AI ecosystem. I'm focused on two sides of it. One is the development side,
Hmm.
those who create the technology, and then for
Hmm.
them, the question is exactly what you said. What are you supposed to do? What does it even mean to develop AI responsibly, and what are you supposed to be doing? The other side, you mentioned investors, and I just want to expand that. So I'm interested in anyone who funnels money into the AI ecosystem. Investors is an audience that I've worked with a lot, especially VCs, because I think startups is a really promising place for AI responsibility, and VCs are those who fund them typically. But also philanthropic foundations, public administration, procurement in public administration is really key for AI responsibility, and it's a field that I've worked in a lot as well. And then
Hmm.
insurance is the next frontier for me. It's a difficult game to
Interesting.
to get into, but they have a financial stake. All of these actors have a financial stake in responsible AI because, in the case of insurance companies, if the company gets sued, it's the insurance company that's gonna pay. So they have a stake in making sure that the company is doing things responsibly. So yes, I just wanted to add a little bit to explain kind of my context. But now to your question, you asked what is it that companies are supposed to be doing, and when in the development life cycle is it supposed to begin? Day one is what I think. Some people, when they think about AI responsibility, they say, "Oh, we'll do it down the line because right now we're just struggling to survive. We don't know what's going to happen next month, even. We can't think of AI ethics now. We'll think about it later when we're bigger, when we're A round, when we're B round, when we're ready for IPO." Um, all of these things, I think, are incorrect. So I like all things having to do with software development, the longer you wait, the more complicated it is to change later. Also,
Yeah.
when you do it at the beginning, you can incorporate those considerations into your business model. And I think that that's the most important thing to keep in mind. Engineers are good at what they do. They don't need me, a non engineer, to tell them how to code. They definitely do not need that. What they do need is for the organization to put them in a position to be able to put the time and resources into responsible AI tasks. Usually, or actually every time in my past experience, that's enough. Once you explain to the engineer, hey, this is your task, this is what you need to do. The problem is you have bias in your system. This is how you're going to measure it. Go for it. Measure and solve it. Right? That's what they do. They don't need the AI ethicists, in most cases, in my opinion, to do that kind of work. What they do need is help getting this internal buy in. So when I'm thinking of giving advice to an engineer, it's about that internal buy in. How can they convince people around them to give them the time, to give them the compute power, to give them all the resources they need to actually do this work and find out what it means to develop their tool responsibly in their specific context. So to me, that's the main tool that I think that engineers need. And so to do that, I think it's really it can be really helpful to start with a list of common risks and then to think of those risks in the context of the product you're developing. So one framework that people can use if they want to, there are many. There's the framework by NIST, the National Institute for Science and Standards and Technology. Here in the US, they're a part of the Department of Commerce. They have a framework called the AIRMF, AI Responsible AI, AIRMF, AI Responsible Risk Management Framework. uh, and yeah, this framework includes, among other things, emphasis on various kinds of risks, right? So you'll find there things like, privacy, fairness, but you can take any list. OECD have principles that are influential, UNESCO, take one of those lists. Or if you do specific technology, like you do generative AI, take something specific to generative AI. There are enough of those lists, of risks. Then for each of those risks, think to yourself, with regard to this risk. Think of your stakeholders. Think of your audience, your target audience of your technology. How could they be harmed? What could happen to them that's related to this risk? For example, fairness. Um, what could be negative fairness outcomes to your target audience? And then also ask yourself about about your company. So it's not enough to think about the target audience and what would happen about them, because unfortunately in many companies that's just not enough to make changes. So also think about what would happen to your company if something were to go wrong. For example, non-compliance, reputation, loss of clients, loss of talent. So sit down with this list of risks, and write down to yourself about each of those risks. Bad case scenario. Who would be harmed? What would happen to them? How bad would it be, right? And then you can prioritize. You can figure out what the top three are. And then maybe you can have an total conversation about that. I think something like this is a great group exercise. Do others agree with you in the company? Maybe you can do, like a all hands meeting or something where everyone talks about this, right? And then people bring up various kinds of risks. And I think that that's the beginning. It's a beginning of something, of raising awareness. And I think that that's where most companies are. In later stages, hopefully you do get buy-in, and then the tendencies to go to writing long documents, frameworks, policies. It can be good to do those things, but often they lead to inaction, because you just spend a lot of time writing a really long document and then nothing happens. So I think it's better to start with a concrete, realistic project you can do. Get that quick win, get that low hanging fruit, do this project, and then most crucially, incorporate the business side of the company. Make the company gain something from this activity. It might be a blog post, it might be an event, right? Get something out of it, because if you don't tie in the business impact, there's not going to be any buy-in.
Interesting. And you mentioned this trade-off, or something which you hear very often, that we'll think about it when we have reached a particular stage, and then in a startup that could be something which is common, where people say that let me kind of focus on building the product or getting to product market fit, and then because the risk could be very different for different kinds of products, and then at an early stage where you yourself don't know whether this is the product which you would scale, there could be that trade-off between how much do you kind of invest from day one versus how much do you invest when you reach product market fit. Have you seen that trade-off, and if yes, what is your advice in these cases?
So I don't think it's a trade-off. That's my answer. Because I've
Hmm.
worked with people starting from proof of concept, right? I've worked with people who are just, it's a month in. They're
Hmm.
developing their idea. And then I work with them and we go through, okay, let's measure your risks. Let's evaluate your risks. Let's evaluate where you stand. Now let's make a plan. And typically, what happens is that they discover, oh, wait, we actually didn't take some things into account, right? And then it's a matter of prioritizing. What is it that you want to do right now? What is it that you want to do later on? Which stage? Like, what things do you want to do before the system is deployed? What things do you want to do after the system is deployed? I think that that is actually helpful to the market fit, because it can allay the concerns of consumers and investors and anyone else that's related to it. So you don't have to find all the problems immediately, solve all the problems immediately. No, not that at all. I mean, you don't do it even for the basic things in your system, right? um,
Yeah.
but you do need to have some kind of a plan, right? You do need to think about what is currently urgent for me to work on. What do I need to do immediately? And then what do I need to put down in writing as my future plan, so I can show this to my investors, so I can show this to my consumers. And companies are telling me, like, already they're getting a lot of questions from consumers, especially around the EUAI Act, since there's been a lot of press about it recently. What is the company doing to align with that? Um, and even regardless of the regulation, there's a lot of sensitivity to issues such as bias. So I'm hearing from startups starting from the seed stage, consumers are worried about this. They want us to show them that we're not going to cause negative reputation for them. So if a company, even at a very early stage, even in pre-seed stage, right, can show those plans to prospective customers, it can actually help them with the market fit. So I see it as something that pushes the company forward rather as a trade-off.
Interesting. And there have been this very different approaches which various companies have followed, right? So, for example, OpenAI released the product, but then also iterated on it very quickly as soon as they saw, let's say, shortcomings or times when ChatGPT was not doing something or doing something which it should not be doing. They would address it. And the second approach was probably what Google did in initial days, that until they are sure about how the model is behaving, they would not kind of release it to the large company. And then again, they feel like two different ends in the spectrum. What has been your experience? What are some of the best practices over there? How should a startup founding team think about that?
Yeah, there's no general answer for this. It's going to be on a case by case basis, but the general thing to do is to think about it. And the question, of course, is not just for the entirety of the system, but every feature. Should you release this feature? And so the best practice is to do an ethics review right at the beginning. Someone ideates the feature. Now there needs to be a decision. Are we going to spend resources even doing a proof of concept for this feature? That's exactly the stage to also do an ethics review and think about, is it worth it? Is it worth the risks? And what are the guardrails, the minimal guardrails that we must put in place to even release this? Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's too much guardrails, so we're not going to even develop the feature. But you see, if there's an ethics review at the same time as like a business review or whatever other reviews the company is doing to decide whether to develop the feature, do an ethics review right at that stage, and then do a check-in, maybe midway, and then as you're getting ready to release, right? Um, so that you can at least have a conversation. Do we want to do this? What is the risk? Is it worth the risk? What I'm seeing often is companies not even going through this thought process. If they stopped to think about it, it could save them resources and also embarrassment.
And any particular examples or use cases where you saw people missed a particular aspect and then kind of change, but when they started thinking about it, that changed the product itself or the feature itself, which you can share with the audience.
I have something that's close to it that comes to mind. This is
Mhm.
the case of Amazon. No, but who was it? I think it was Amazon and the CVs. Yeah, I think it was Amazon. I'm sorry if I'm wrong. um, yeah, I want to tell the story about Amazon and what happened to them. It was a save at the last moment, so I think it's a good case study. So Amazon, I think it was 2016 or something like that. They wanted to build an AI system that would sort through resumes because they get a lot of resumes at Amazon. So ideally,
Mhm.
it would be a system that receives resumes and tells you, okay, who should I interview, or even who should I accept, who should I offer the position to. And they worked on it for a year, and then they started testing it, amongst other things, for bias. And so then they noticed that actually the system disfavors women, and they were surprised because they didn't have any features about gender. So how could that happen?
Mhm.
So they looked into it, you see. Good step. They tested for bias. They found bias. They looked in, what is the reason? Um, and they found that the AI latched on to patterns in how candidates wrote their CVs. So the system disfavored resumes that had things like women's rugby team on them. So the word women's caused disfavoring of CVs. Certain women-only colleges caused ranking down of CVs, certain usage of terms that men more commonly use in CVs were elevated. So they found those things. You see, so this was good. They stopped to check. They found their bias. Their decision was to scrap the whole project. They realized that even though they could fix those things that they just now discovered, they could fix those, but they realized that there might be other things, maybe not just about gender, maybe also about race, that it would be very, very difficult and it wouldn't be worth it. And so they scrapped the whole project. And I think it was for the best, because if the project were to see the light of day, they could be liable for many, many lawsuits.
Yeah. So I think brilliant example of the kind of risks which are there when people are dealing with these products, and then if you don't think through these aspects, what are the risks you can run into? So if someone wants to now do this as a exercise again, uh, what are the areas to focus on? Do the lists which you mentioned, so from NIST or OECD, do they have enough details which can be used, or there is more than those lists which the team should go through?
Here's the problem with some of those lists. They either have too much or not enough. But I
Yes.
can do a shout out to myself, because I've actually built an exercise and you can find it on my website. So I'll actually put a link to it.
Mhm,
What I've done in this exercise is it's a 3-part process. So I have a self-guided deck so people can just go through it.
mhm,
So the idea is to focus on what rights might be violated or elevated through the process, right? So you start by identifying key stakeholders that are important to you. And then you think of what rights may be, maybe violated. And you can use any source for that is important to you. Maybe you care about human rights. And so then you focus on human rights. Maybe you care about data rights. You see? So it's an open-ended process that allows people to focus on what matters most to them. And so that's how I'm also avoiding necessarily committing to like any specific entity. But I think this exercise can be valuable, and it can be especially valuable if you do it in a group, because other people might not have the same opinion as you, and then you might have really interesting and important conversations in your company about who might be who might be who might we harm, unintentionally. What I hear a lot from companies when I do things like that, or from people when I do things like that with them, is that, oh, wait, we have thought a lot about the benefits, but we actually haven't spent time systematically thinking about the potential risks. So I'll put this in the chat so you can post it later.
yeah.
Yeah, I also just put in the chat the link to the story about Amazon.
Sure. And the other aspect which was very interesting about that example was, almost you need to think afresh as opposed to, what you have used while building these models. So while there is no feature for gender, but until you test it uh, independently, quite often I've seen data scientists say, oh, we have not put in gender as a feature, so we don't need to test for gender inequality in the model, and they don't realize some of these features which the model makes by inferring from the data. So given that, do you see, for example, a equivalent of model auditing, or a equivalent of software testing becoming more and more important over time? And if so, what are some of the fundamentals which the companies can kind of invest in from a long term perspective?
Yeah, definitely. So some laws are going there actually. So one of the laws that's really prominent in this space is the law from New York City. So not even the state, the city of New York has a law about AI in HR systems. I think one of the reasons that bias in AI based HR systems became so prominent is because of this story from Amazon. It became very well known. And so recently, there was a new law that is now in effect in New York City that there must be an audit for impact if you're going to use your AI based HR system in New York. So, because this law is already in place, it feeds an ecosystem of auditing. And I do think it's going to increase more and more because why do we need third party audits? Because we want a third party to verify, right? Of course, a company is going to present itself as, as well as it can, but we need this third party perspective. So yes, I do see audits of AI impacts in AI systems responsibility. I think it's a growing field, and I also want to add something to your question because I think you really said it well. You can't take anything for granted. Even if you didn't intentionally put gender as a feature, does not mean you don't have gender discrimination. And I want to add to that with another example. Sometimes the discrimination is of a different kind of what you expect, because sometimes to understand discrimination you need someone who is just an expert in this, in discrimination, in social dynamics. So an example of that is a really, really good research paper on discrimination in mortgage loans, with AI based systems. So this is a study that came out end of 2022. I'll put a link to it in the chat later. Um, this study wanted to compare racial discrimination in mortgage loans in the US, compare between human decisions and AI decisions. And so they started with collecting information on mortgage loan decisions in the US. So apparently you have to report those. So there's a public repository on that. And so they've calculated discrimination on that data set, human based decisions. And they found that people who were Black, but other than that, exactly the same as a white applicant, were 54% less likely to get their mortgage loan approved. So that's pretty bad. That's present day
Yeah.
discrimination as, with human decisions. So that's like the, I guess, terrible baseline. But then they said, okay, what if an AI were to make those decisions instead? And so they took an off-the-shelf mortgage loan, like underwriting for mortgage decisions tools, and they ran all the data through it, and they got discrimination was worse. 67% less likely to get your mortgage loan approved if you're Black, in comparison to someone who is exactly the same as you, but they're white. So that's one myth that is good to pay attention to. People think, oh, AI just reflects the same discrimination we have as humans. No, often it makes it worse. Second thing that they did in this research study, they said, okay, but what if now we take this off the shelf AI tool for underwriting, but then we slap on top of it some tool for fixing bias, right? So they took off the shelf tools for, reducing bias. And what did they get? They did get equal rates of loan approval for different demographics. However, two things happened. One, the error rate increased by 300%.
Wow.
So no one will ever use this. It's unusable. No lender will use this. And also, while you had the same level of approval, the loan amount was less for Black people. So when you solve what kind of bias, or when you notice one kind of bias, there might be other kinds that you're not familiar with, which is why it's really important to consult with someone who's aware, who's an expert on the social dynamics related to that field that you're in.
Yeah. And I guess this problem goes to almost next level when you're dealing with generative AI tools, where you don't even have these concrete ways to evaluate how the model is performing, and then the domain is still evolving. So what do you do in scenarios like that?
Yeah, it starts with testing and measuring. I think the first step, choose what you're going to measure. Choose it really carefully. Most companies, they don't measure, right? Choose what you're going to measure. Once you know what it is that you want to improve, then the engineers kick in. Then they know what to do, right? That's their job. But you first choose that. With generative AI, say with images or texts, like what are you gonna? It's very difficult. So you just choose something that's representative. I'll give you an example. Another really good research study that came out recently was about gender discrimination in reference letters written by generative AI. And so you see, they run an experiment. They also always run an experiment, but an experiment is a way to measure, right? And so they decided to feed into the generative AI resumes of people in different variations, right? So same resume, different names, right? And then the experiment varied how much detail they give in the prompt about the individual. And then they compare the results, right? And what they found is that the reference letters for men and women had different language in them. Guess who was described as genius? You know, so different nouns, for the men, more, the kind of nouns that would favor men versus the kind of nouns that women might be described with. So you see, you can't test the entirety of it. Like what are you testing? You can't test the entire system, but you choose an artifact. You choose something. In that case, you chose let's try reference letters, right? Let's make it generate something and test that. Um, Another related example, recently there was this big article about Bloomberg. They tested generative, generated images. Again, you can't test like all images that the model would spit out. So instead, I said, okay, let's focus on professions. You see, so you choose one thing that's representative or likely to produce the kind of problem you have in mind. So they generated images of different professionals. Actually, there are like 8 academic papers that do the same. I looked it up later. But they all do something similar. They're like, let's choose an artifact that represents it. And then let's compare it to some kind of baseline. So many of those studies are comparing to census data, right? Or other kind of national repositories of professions and the genders and races, right? And so then they can compare, okay, we're going to generate some images, right? And because, of course, it's not deterministic, you need to generate a bunch. So let's generate, say, like 10 images per prompt or something. And then let's do statistics and compare that statistics to what we see from some kind of, ground truth, like developers like to say like the census reporting or something. Does that answer the question?
It does, although we are still relying on a very small sample and measuring it only for the specific metrics which we have chosen that these are something which we would want to study for. Whereas the
Right.
impact of these tools and models is a lot bigger, and the impact could be unknown to a lot of users who end up kind of using these tools.
That's
So
right.
that risk is
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Uh,
right. Um, yeah. And so I want to add 2 things to that. Yeah. Because it can generate many, many things. We cannot test everything it generates, right? Um, but it's important to not let it freeze us. Yes, the task
yeah,
is huge, and maybe we cannot do it perfectly, but we need to start somewhere. So we're gonna start with one thing. Let's start with one thing, like one place that we feel our system might be discriminatory. Find something to measure that, improve on that metric. Probably your solution is going to be more general than just that problem. Suppose you have, you know, the Bloomberg experiment, right? Suppose a company did this experiment internally and found out that they have some bias. Maybe they want to change something in the API. That something in the API is going to apply more broadly, not just for professions, right? So they did solve for something more general. And then the company can iterate once they feel, okay, this initial, maybe small problem that we started with, we're good with that. How do we improve? How do we do better? And it can be really helpful to open things up for the public, right? So recently there was a really great hackathon at Penn State, Pennsylvania University. They did a hackathon again for images. And the task of the hackathon, produce images that show discrimination, right? And then the participants came up with like great things that I personally wouldn't have thought of. And a company can do something like that. They can do a red teaming event like this with experts only, or even with the public, make it more participatory, right? Get input from others. And then you think of it as an ongoing, journey of improvement. Like, it's okay. You're never going to be perfect, but you can do incrementally better.
Interesting. And do you see a difference in, open source tools versus closed source tools? And while, that might not be as big or as noticeable right now, but from a, again, long-term perspective, is open source a more robust way to kind of address some of these biases, or it's the risk is likely irrespective of which tools you use, or I mean, is there a difference between open source versus proprietary from a purely building a responsible AI product?
Interesting. Um, I don't know. I don't know about this classification, but I do know that they're not all the same. So one of those research papers that I've mentioned that did comparison for images did compare a couple of them. They compared different kinds of generative AI platforms. So one of them, for example, compared images from Midjourney, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion.
Stable diffusion.
Yeah. And so you see that the discrimination is, they all discriminate, but not to the same degree, right? So another choice point for organizations when you get started, yeah, which foundation are you going to use for your technology, right? And that's why it's really important to think about those things at the very beginning, because once you chose, oh, I'm going to go with Stable Diffusion, or I'm going to go with something else, it's too late. You cannot change it later. But what if Stable Diffusion is way more discriminatory than another option that's available for you? So for me, I'm not dividing it as much, open source versus closed source, but more specifically, what are the options available to you as an engineer or as a tech company? How do you make your choice? Are you thinking about AI responsibility when you do make this choice? Are you testing? Or maybe you don't necessarily want to test yourself, but look for those research papers, right? Maybe the information is already out there for you, and you just need to take it into account when you decide.
And just one last question in the same chain of thoughts. Uh, what happens when, let's say, the primary metric which we were keeping, that this is what we would measure to measure bias, itself needs to change? So either the business model has evolved, or the business use case has evolved, or the way the model is getting used has changed, which would translate into the metric changing. And then so what do you do in scenarios like those, where all your previous optimization might get disrupted, and the model may not no longer be as robust as to some of these scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, as in other fields, sometimes it's unavoidable. So you've used a metric, you've decided for whatever reason that this metric is no longer good, and you just need to switch. I think there's no way around it sometimes. This kind of problem, of course, is familiar. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, Ravit, for taking time out. Towards the end of each show, we ask a few rapid fire questions with our guests, and the idea is to just know you better. So whatever first thoughts come to your mind, we would love to hear those.
Sorry
Uh,
again. The first thoughts,
so
yeah.
yeah. So, what is the uh, scenario which keeps you awake at night about AI not being responsible?
Dis Disinformation. That's the thing that for me is really troubling. I searched something on Google last week and I got an AI summary at the top of the page. Summary was false.
Mhm.
I barely even noticed that it was an AI generated summary because you know how it is. I'm in between things. I just like I need something really quickly. I see it. I barely even noticed. I noticed that the information was incorrect because it is something that I know a little bit about. So it was completely didn't make any sense. But it's polluting the internet with masses and masses of false information. We might lose the little access we have to reliable information. What if we cannot rely anymore at all on things we find online and we don't have a way to verify? Moreover, what if it brings down science? So recently there was a research paper also showing indications of massive increase in use of generative AI in scientific papers, but it's full of misinformation. What if, you know, sure, science is not perfect, but what if it's like barely reliable? We can't rely on science. We can't rely on anything that happens online. To me, that's the most dystopian scenario. And so going back to the beginning, you asked me about existential risk. And I think that people who imagine dystopian scenarios, if you're going to go dystopian, go all the way. This too is very dystopian.
Yeah. it is. Uh, and when we go back and look at the starting point you had, right? So the current version of AI, does this look objective and value free to you, or you know it's actually almost the diametrical opposite thing which we have created?
No, of course it's not value free. Of course it's full of values. But again, it's not a bug, it's a feature. That is just how life is.
Great, great. Thanks, thanks a lot, Ravit, for your time and so much to learn. I think it's such a topic where we can probably spend many more hours, and then would love to have you again on the show sometime in future. But thanks a lot for your time.
Likewise, thank you for having me. And for anyone who's interested in more from me, my social media is LinkedIn. So feel free to follow me there.